Welcome to Books and Bridges. New our series on treasures of world literature by exploring the mind of Emily Dickinson. And how, might you ask, can poetry be relevant in a time of global pandemic and election madness that we're experiencing now? Well, hopefully our beloved guest and dear friend, Mark Matheson, can answer that question. Let me just read you Mark's bio. Mark Matheson has taught English at the University of Utah for over 20 years. A native Utahn, he received his MA from the University of Utah and his doctorate from the University of Oxford. Professor Matheson travels to London with his students, where he teaches seminars on British literature. He also serves as the director of the University of Utah-based Tanner Lectures on Human Values. He continues to teach and greatly enjoys advocating for students' educational interests through the Muse Project. Mark, you're doing great work for our community, and we are excited to hear from you tonight. I'll let you just take the floor.
Thank you so much, Nathan. I really want to thank you for the invitation, and I've always had such a great experience meeting with Books and Bridges and the wonderful group that you bring together. And I think it's terrific that what you do with this program is bring people together in the community who really have a passionate interest in literature and in discussing it, and finding a kind of community of learning and of literary interest. I think that's a tremendously valuable social project, as well as an aesthetic project. So thanks so much, Nathan, for everything you do to sustain Books and Bridges. It's a great program, and I'm just honored to be part of it.
Appreciate that.
I was telling Nathan just before we got on that I'm not an Emily Dickinson scholar. I've taught her poetry quite a bit here at the University of Utah. And when I was exchanging emails with Nathan prior to our gathering tonight, he mentioned that, from his perspective, in this very challenging year that we're living through, we could all benefit from reading more Emily Dickinson, and this struck me as absolutely true. And it aligns with my own experience, in which I've often turned to Dickinson's poems in times of personal need, and for the effects that reading them produces in me. And those effects range from encouragement and steadiness to awe at her ability and her vision and the beauty of her work. And I thought it might be a good idea to discuss some of Dickinson's poems with you tonight that manifest faith in human experience, in being alive, and our condition as living human beings. And in part because this kind of faith, I think, has taken a drubbing this year, and we're all maybe a little depleted in that respect. And we all know the reasons for why we live in such a difficult time. So I guess I'm confessing a little embarrassedly that I do find reading Dickinson's poems to be very therapeutic. She's a very great artist, not one writing a well-intentioned self-help manual. So bringing the therapeutic dimension of her work into our discussion tonight may be something of a categorical mistake. But I find her art bracing and sustaining, and I think the basis for this might be her clear-eyed perception of how difficult human experience really is. In popular culture, I think there's been a tendency over the decades to read her poems as offering a kind of simple and straightforward uplift, to locate her in a kind of tradition of sentimental American poetry. And that we'll sometimes have people emphasize lines from her work, such as, "Hope is the thing with feathers." And that's a great line, but Dickinson isn't a simple artist, nor does she give us a kind of simple uplift, I think, as we read. I think the generativity of her work, the way we respond to her work, is based on, the depth of her own engagement as a human being and a woman and an artist with some of the most difficult aspects of our experience. By the way, I've heard "Hope is the thing with feathers," I've read it quoted quite a bit lately, which is of great value in the popular media. And so I think it's interesting that Dickinson is being cited for the kind of encouragement that her poetry can offer us in our own troubled time. But as I was writing this piece for tonight, I found myself thinking of Dickinson's affiliations with other traditions based on her willingness not to turn away from, but to confront the devastating emotional experiences and pain that life confronts us with. And it is out of this confrontation that she makes, I believe, that her most powerful affirmations come. And I think that her poetry is collectively very much a work of affirmation. And so some of these contexts I've been thinking of are literary, some contexts with which I think she has some affiliations. I think of her work, for instance, in the context of Greek tragedy, specifically as Nietzsche understood it, as a dramatic movement and efflorescence that engaged fully with the horrors of human life, but which nevertheless affirms and celebrates our existence. And I also have been thinking of Dickinson's work as bearing a strong relationship with the book of Job, as I believe it ought to be interpreted, not as a story in which an autocratic God puts the suffering Job in his place for allegedly presumptuous questions, but rather as a poem of spiritual transformation in which Job's passionate search for the truth is rewarded by his being gifted with the divine vision, as it is evoked with great beauty by the voice from the whirlwind in that incredible poem. Dickinson's own poems, I think, suggest that she consciously understood her work as an artist in these terms, the terms that I've associated with Greek tragedy and the book of Job. And I think this becomes particularly clear in some of her poems about poetry. And I'd like you to consider, for instance, and I'll read it for you, the first stanza of poem number 544. And it goes like this: "The martyr poets did not tell, but wrought their pang in syllable, that when their mortal name be numb, their mortal fate encouraged some." Right? In other words, she's saying that the martyr poets didn't simply speak, they wrought their experience into the form of a poem, of poetry. And I think it's interesting. I mean, overall, the tone of this stanza is not pitched particularly high. It says that poetry is a gift from the poet out of the poet's experience of mortality to those who live after. And to some of them, it will provide encouragement. But thinking about this first stanza of the poem. Why are poets martyrs? And I regard this as a very important identification on Dickinson's part and in Dickinson's work. And I take it to mean that poets who are true poets in the highest sense of the word, according to Dickinson's understanding, out of love for other human beings and for beauty, sacrifice themselves to the full experience of this life's emotional pain. They choose exposure rather than a life of ordinary psychological self-protection. And because of this, they move beyond merely speaking in their poems, which become the consequence, the result of acts of genuine creation. And the experience that the poets transmute into verbal substance, into language, is their pang, their intense pain, which is too intense, I think, simply to be told. And their poems become a testament of their, I think, a testament of both deep truths about life's devastations, but also about the poet's ability to survive them in the name of love and beauty, and of strengthening other members of the human community who are perhaps yet unborn. Now, I know this is saying a lot. It's a large claim to make for poets, but I think when Dickinson refers to the martyr poets, this is what she means. And this is the claim she's making. And I would also say that, Dickinson's perception of the poet's function, as the term martyr poets implies, is borne out for me by my reading of her own work. And I'd like to share with you a few of these poems that have convinced me of this, beginning with poems where pain is faced very directly, or even suffered as a kind of incapacitating blow, rather than averted. I'll start with poem number 341, which is about the experience of catastrophic emotional pain, and which I regard as one of her very finest works. Let me just read it to you, and then we'll talk about this poem and some other poems where she articulates pain and its consequences so powerfully. Again, this is poem number 341 in the Thomas Johnson ordering of the poems, which is a kind of standard. After great pain, a formal feeling comes. The nerves sit ceremonious, like tombs. The stiff heart questions, was it he that bore, and yesterday, or centuries before? The feet mechanical go round of ground or air or aught. A wooden way, regardless grown, a quartz contentment, like a stone. This is the hour of lead, remembered if outlived, as freezing persons recollect the snow. First chill, then stupor, then the letting go. Of course, she's describing in that last portion of the poem what we know of as hypothermia and death by hypothermia. I think this could well be a poem about grief at the death of one beloved. And perhaps there never has been a poet who articulates grief as compellingly as Emily Dickinson does. I'm thinking in this context of poems like number 49, I Never Lost As Much But Twice. I'm only mentioning poems tonight that are on the list that in a professorial way I assigned you to read for tonight. Number 49, I Never Lost As Much But Twice, and also number 1732, My Life Closed Twice Before Its Close. In the second of these, the speaker wonders if becoming immortal after death will, quote, unveil a third event to me, so huge, so hopeless to conceive as these two end quote, as these two losses that have befallen her. It's an astonishing question. And in the context of the poem, the speaker asks it in genuine earnest, which is a kind of testament to the depths of her pain and her grief. In I Never Lost As Much But Twice, the speaker goes on to say, and that was in the sod, which clearly points to the grave and the death of persons close to her. But she is confronting a third loss in this brief poem, and she is utterly depleted emotionally. She stands now before the door of God, once again, for the third time. And as a beggar, she seeks a crumb of emotional sustenance. Angels twice descending, she tells us, reimbursed my store. Burglar, banker, father, I am poor once more. These three nouns with which she addresses God in a single line, I think they trace a kind of deepening despair and crisis as she, the speaker, struggles with the great sense of loss and grief. I think the line constitutes a really astonishing cry from the heart. The extremity of suffering and of pain is, I think, palpable in the way this poem concludes. But back to after great pain, a formal feeling comes. And in this poem, pain may go even further. It incapacitates the sufferer. I think the poem's third and fourth lines, they go like this: the stiff heart questions, was it he that bore? And yesterday or centuries before? I think those lines allude to the crucifixion. And the person baffled by pain loses memory and the sense of time, the poem tells us. For that person, the crucifixion might have been centuries ago, or perhaps it happened yesterday. The sufferer cannot place it. And this person's capacity for awareness and self-direction have been lost. And the feet of this person go round and round in a kind of purposeless circle. In the, let me, as I mentioned, I've read these poems with groups of people before, not all that often, and sometimes quite a long time ago. But I remember some folks who, in discussing this poem, have tried to save it from being the kind of unequivocal confrontation with pain that it is, pain that is perhaps an invincible opponent. And I think it is very hard to acknowledge that human beings can die of grief. Let me remind you of the last 4 lines of the poem, which are the passage that these friends have read in a way that tries to make the poem a little more upbeat. The poem concludes this way: "This is the hour of lead, remembered if outlived, as freezing persons recollect the snow. First chill, then stupor, then the letting go." And some have read the letting go, the last words of the poem, as a wise decision made by those who experience pain simply to let it go and get on with their lives. Now, on this reading, the poem culminates in a kind of last-minute victory for self-help and a kind of therapeutic resolution. But I don't think this is really, that reading really is accountable to Dickinson's poem. I think it's clear that the letting go is the letting go of the effort to live and perhaps the will to live, which is something in common, the poem asserts, experienced in common by those in the crisis of devastating emotional pain and those who are freezing to death. Well, I want to talk about 2 more poems that deal directly with pain, and then I promise we'll move on. There is hope out there, but I think that, again, the quality and the completeness of Dickinson's engagement with emotional crisis and pain is what gives her affirmations so much authority and power. There's a poem, we won't read all of it, number 512, called "The Soul Has Bandaged Moments." And in this poem, Dickinson seems to explore the inner life of a woman who experiences what psychologists call intrusive thoughts. They come unbidden and they tyrannize her inner life, and her helplessness before them is excruciating, both to her as a character in the poem and to us as readers. The poem suggests that this horrifying subjection to this inner trauma is really a consequence of mental illness. And if the poem feels kind of modern to you, I can tell you it does to me too. And I think it implicitly looks forward, or perhaps prophesies toward psychotherapy in general as a field dedicated to the transformative practice of liberating human beings from neurotic compulsions, such as are visited upon the character whom Dickinson suggests and represents in the poem. In addition to writing about sudden loss and psychological illness as sources of personal pain, Dickinson sometimes explores the role of social institutions in this respect. Consider her poem, "She Rose to His Requirement," poem number 732, which somehow manages to evoke the whole history of a marriage in 12 brief lines. And I am astonished over and over again as I return to Dickinson by how much she can achieve poetically in an 8 or 12 line poem. It's extraordinary. And I think you'll see a very vivid example of this quality of her work and this capacity of hers as a poet in poem 732, "She Rose to His Requirement." So let me read that for you. And then I have a few things to say about it. She rose to his requirement, dropped the playthings of her life to take the honorable work of woman and of wife. If aught, of course, aught means anything, if aught she missed in her new day of amplitude or awe or first perspective, or the gold in using wear away, it lay unmentioned. As the sea develop pearl and weed, but only to himself be known the fathoms they abide. I think it's this tremendous poem, one of her best, I think, from beginning to end. It's a poem of extraordinary social observation, a profound sympathy on the part of Dickinson, who, of course, never married, for the marital experience of other women in her society. And I think we encounter here some of the most refined and delicate ironies in all of Dickinson's work. Once again, I've discussed this poem with some who have attempted quite strenuously to salvage the husband in the work and thus the marriage. And they've done this by proposing, hopefully, that himself, that word in the penultimate line, refers to the man who made the initial requirement of the woman. But the antecedent of himself is the sea, which functions as the subject in the poem's concluding simile. And what an extraordinary simile it is, evoking as it does the woman's development, the accretion within her of a deep inner life, which she tends in silence as a kind of refuge from her disappointment, a compensatory order known only to her, which is not without beauty and objects to be cherished, that lavish underwater weed and the pearl. Those are the mysterious representatives of her even more mysterious inner life. It's a narrative third-person poem, which is not really a common mode for Dickinson. And I'm struck by what I read as the author's profound respect for its woman character, who offers a stoic, but also in its way, a creative response to a failed conventional marriage. It's a poem, I think, in which Dickinson speaks at a respectful distance and very movingly for a woman who does not, in her own personal life, have a voice. Well, I want to turn to something perhaps just a little bit brighter now. Poem number 675, a poem which seems to accept pain quite sublimely as inevitable in human life, and even to see it as an occasion, perhaps even as a stimulus or necessary precondition for creativity of all kinds. I assigned this poem to you in the section called Poems About Poetry, but you might well have questioned this, since at a literal level, the poem does not belong in any obvious way to this category. But let me read the poem to you, which, again, is one of my favorites. In some ways, the whole statement that the poem will make is there in the very first line. It's an assertion that has some, I think, quite radical and far-reaching implications at the metaphorical level. Essential oils are wrung. The attar from the rose be not expressed by suns alone. It is the gift of screws. The general rose decay, but this in lady's drawer makes summer when the lady lie in ceaseless rosemary. I think that last stanza is among the most beautiful that Dickinson ever wrote. I can never read it too often. I just think it's a poem of stunning verbal surprise. Attar, remember, attar is the essential oil made by the pressing in a press of the screw of the press of rose petals. And the first stanza says that the sun is, of course, necessary for the rose to develop and to bloom and to spread its petals. But those petals must also be wrung, the poem tells us, to produce a beauty that is lasting. At the literal level, we move in the second stanza to the contrast between the decay of the typical rose that simply grows, blooms, withers, and dies, and the attar, or essential oil pressed from rose petals in the lady's drawer, which makes summer when the lady lie in ceaseless rosemary. This feminine turn of the poem here, as we might call it in the second stanza, seems deeply fitting. Like the attar, the memory of the lady continues fragrantly long after her physical death, which implies, I think, that she herself produced, in the process of being wrung by life, acts and objects of beauty for others that have made her memory eternal. Rosemary is, of course, an herb associated with memory in Hamlet, the play, and long before, and long, long before the work of Emily Dickinson. And to exist as the departed lady does in ceaseless rosemary is to be remembered forever. The poem suggests that not only poems, but lives can be wrought beautifully through one's experience of harrowing pain. To live, I think, in this way, as this lady has implicitly done, is to achieve greatness. I'm reminded of the Homeric view that nothing great can come into human life without Ate, goddess of conflict and difficulty and discord. In some ways, how we respond to those inevitable experiences in human life, that will determine in many ways, the kinds of contributions through art, through a beautiful remark, through sustenance of other kinds to our fellow human beings. It does remind me of Homer, but the tone of the poem, especially in that second stanza, is so serene. It establishes the poem as being about the fray in which we all find ourselves, but it's somehow above the fray. It points us beyond it to another kind of achievement, another kind of realization of goodness and beauty that we can somehow impart to others and give them strength, which I think is exactly what Emily Dickinson's poems do for us in the 21st century as we read them. I go on to say that I think the little vials of essential oil or attar are also poems. I think they represent poems metaphorically. Beautiful things that come out of long trial, long suffering, and that are passed down the generations, nurturing and giving joy to individual human beings and to humanity in a distant futurity. And I'm strengthened in my reading of the essential oils as a kind of metaphor for poems by poem number 448. This was a poet, in which we're told the poet, and this is a generic poet, distills an adder, back to the term adder, an essential oil so immense from the familiar species that perish by the door, that those of us who are readers of this poet can't believe that we possibly missed it before reading the poem, but somehow we did. Well, I feel that we're ascending now, and we come to some of Dickinson's poems about love, which is an experience for her fully implicated in pain and despair, is also, I think, for her, their great antagonist. I recently discovered a poem. I haven't read all of Dickinson's poems, which is kind of comforting. It means there's a great and rich future of reading out there, as well as rereading. I recently discovered her poem "To Pile Like Thunder to Its Close," which is poem number 1247. And in this poem, maybe quite a late poem, she asserts the identity, the oneness of poetry and love. It seems as though in the first stanza that it is going to be a poem about poetry and the almost the shuddering effect that it can have on its reader. But then there's a turn, and poetry is not only affiliated with love, but identified with love. So here's this 8-line poem. To pile like thunder to its close, then crumble grand away, while everything created hid. This would be poetry. Or love. The two coeval come. We both and neither prove, experience either and consume, for none see God and live. I think it's an amazing poem. And let me just say this about it. I think it's really quite remarkable to assert that love and poetry are coeval, which means that in the unfolding of human history, love and poetry were born at a stroke. They were simultaneous births. And more than this, that our experience of either love or poetry is fundamentally the same. And what the poem tells us in its final line is that this is an experience of becoming witness to the divine vision. And one poem I didn't put in for you, but it's a 2-line poem, so I think I can remember it. It also talks about, how maybe the experience of poetry can move us into a more visionary understanding of our world and our lives and of our prospects. The 2-line poem is, not revelation 'tis that waits, but our unfurnished eyes. It's very hard to write a good 2-line poem, and somehow it seems to come very easily to Dickinson. But the idea that we can amend our vision, our spiritual vision, through something like, a sustained engagement with Dickinson's poetry, is a perspective that we can derive from within the body of her poetry itself. I think that, with a poem like After Great Pain, we are presented by a human being who is so shocked and dazed by the pain that that person's agency is greatly diminished. And I think when, Dickinson, in some of the poems I'm reading now, projects an order of love and poetry which somehow is accessible to us, there is a kind of restoration in these poems of agency, and it becomes quite extraordinary, how powerful we are as individual human beings in terms of what we can give, what transformative gifts we can impart to our fellow human beings. And this is another poem I haven't been reading for very long. It's Dickinson's poem, That First Day, number 659. And it's an example of what I just said. It reveals how a single remark from the beloved can transfigure a lifetime, both the past and the present of the person to whom that remark is gifted. And I'll just read it briefly to you. And we'll talk just a little bit more about it. That first day when you praised me, sweet, and said that I was strong and could be mighty if I liked. That day, the days among, glows central, like a jewel between diverging golds, the minor one that gleamed behind, and vaster of the worlds. And some of Dickinson's typical difficulty as a poet in the second stanza, but I think we can make it out quite successfully. The kind remark in the poem, given from presumably the beloved to his beloved, we will say, becomes the point from which the speaker in the poem reckons time, the whole arc of her life. That moment, that remark is a jewel. And it's a jewel in a gold band, the second stanza tells us, that reaches back to the beginning, to birth, the birth of the speaker, and that extends into the future to her death. But before that, it opens up a kind of prospect of a vaster, infinitely richer prophetic world, the world in which she now lives and moves. That kind of power to reorder and inspire and transform a life is within our gift, the poem tells us, as individual human beings. I like that term, that phrase, what is in our gifts. That means what it is possible for us to give. And the poem suggests that what it is possible for us to give to one another is really quite inestimable. This is also the case in As If I Asked a Common Alms, poem 323. Alms, as you know, means the offering sought by a beggar. And I think this is actually the last poem I will probably read to you, but let me read it, poem 323. As if I asked a common alms, and in my wondering hand a stranger pressed a kingdom, and I, bewildered, stand. As if I asked the Orient, had it for me a morn, and it should lift its purple dikes and shatter me with dawn. It's an amazing poem in which it's composed entirely of two extended similes, but we are never told the referent, that is, whatever it is to which the similes refer. Dickinson doesn't tell us what the experience is that is illuminated by these comparisons. But I think read in the context of her poetry in general, it is almost certainly love. And it's about how love can come as a kind of shattering surprise and a gift beyond all value, that comes to us in some kind of unprecedented way, perhaps when we are least expecting it. And I think the supreme poem about love and its effect on an actual speaker of one of the poems, I think in Dickinson's work, the poem that comes to mind in that regard is very much a poem about how love is a force for spiritual liberation. And it's poem number 508, the first line of which is, I'm seated, I've stopped being theirs. And it's a poem about baptism, her baptism as a child, when she was a little more than an infant, and then a kind of second baptism through what great event we are not precisely told, but I think undoubtedly through some great experience of love, whether human love or divine love. And I'm happy to talk about that poem if you'd like to, or any of the others on our list as we move forward. I'll just conclude this part of the evening by saying that I recommend that you read and reread these poems in our own difficult moment, not because they avoid the most painful aspects of life, but precisely because they engage with them. And out of that engagement comes the remarkable affirmations and visions that Dickinson's poetry offers us. And you know, as Nathan and I agree, the later months of 2020 are a time when we can use the affirmations that are available to us in the work of Emily Dickinson.
Thank you very much, Mark. As always, you really know how to bring out the nuance of human feeling that may be hidden from most of our sight. So, you know, and uncover things that we surely did not notice ourselves. I think we have about 10 minutes for questioning. I'd like to just start out with a comment that may lead to a question, which is what I noticed through all of these poems is a kind of impulse to survivability, to survival. Yeah. It seems like there's a certain desperation that comes, that is suffused in her work, which is, you know, the desperation, not the desperation, but the survivability of memory, the survivability of the pen of the poet, the survivability of the human being through tragedy. And it's like there's a certain clinging kind of sensation when you read these poems. She's clinging to something solid through the life experience that fades away, and the words of the poet that can fade away. And I think through her own poetry, she has achieved some kind of mode in which, the human experience clings and it survives.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with you entirely, Nathan. I think that, we could call it poetry for survival. And I was talking with one of the U's lead accountants earlier this week, and I like him very much, and he's wise. And he said, in our moment, survival is success. And I pass that on as an observation that I think is true. And I think that survival, sometimes we're reduced to merely that level of existence. We're trying to survive. And Dickinson doesn't stop there. She wants to project other possibilities. She has a poem that begins, "I dwell in possibility." And that is surely one of her more, inspired and vital moments as a poet and a human being, that she can see all life as possibility. She has another poem, 501, I think, that begins, "The world is not conclusion. There is something far more beautiful than we could ever know or expect out there beyond us." And it's in an order of transcendence that we have access to, however difficult that access might be. And so, yeah, it's about facing the worst. I think this body of work and surviving it, and being, in a sense, refined by the fire, and being able to produce, works of great beauty and works that impart faith in our common human experience.
That's nice. Well, we have one question from Carrie Mason. I'll just read it on the screen.
Okay.
She asks, "At one point in her life, Emily said, quote, 'I never enjoyed such perfect peace and happiness as the short time in which I felt I had found my Savior,' unquote. She went on to say it was her, quote, 'greatest pleasure to commune alone with the great God and to feel that he would listen to my prayers,' unquote. Based on her poetry, do you feel Emily's relationship with God was strengthened throughout her life, in part because of her deep introspection? Or did her faith in God appear to diminish throughout her life, perhaps due to the deep grief she experienced from an early age?"
I think that's a wonderful question. And, I have to tell you, I don't really know enough about Dickinson's biography, to venture an answer to that question. I think she had a very complicated relationship with Christianity. It may be like her great romantic poet predecessor, William Blake. She had a very highly individual understanding of Christianity, and I do think that the faith did provide her with a kind of vocabulary and a kind of understanding of the sublime that was very, very important to her. And I think that, and again, I'm basing all of this on a reading of her poetry, not her biography, but I think I'm on firm ground there. And I would also say that that a poem like "There Came a Day at Summer's Full," which is on the list and which we didn't talk about, suggests the depth of her spiritual affinity with Christ and in a larger sense with Christianity. It's a very, very beautiful poem about a kind of, I think, human love affair that can't come to fruition in that end. But there is a kind of, pledging of hearts in, deeply Christian terms, with a lot of Christian symbolism in the poem, that this marriage will be only postponed and take place at the supper of the Lamb, and in the kind of transfigured world of Revelation and of heaven. And so I'm struck by how deeply imbued she is, again, by her understanding of Christ. And I think that, there are poems in which she expresses despair. I mean, in one of the poems we talked about tonight, she addresses God as burglar, right? You took my beloved from me, right? You stole it. You're a burglar. You stole him or her. You are a burglar. You're also a banker. And she has this wonderful, kind of a sustained metaphor that she works with through many poems, where, our inner emotional resources are figured in terms of outward wealth and money, right? And so when she calls or addresses God as a banker, she's saying, I need some more money. I don't have any internal resources anymore. I need to be restored, as I was restored twice before. And angels reimbursed my store. That is the kind of emotional, what's the word I'm looking for? What a merchant has to sell, right? And inventory, that's the word I'm looking for. And then she says, Father. Boy, that's such a, burglar is an accusation. Banker is, I'm working with this. I've been restored to a kind of, if not inner abundance, at least a kind of, living wage emotionally before. But then she says, Father, exclamation point, I am poor once more. Father is so much more intimate and suggests the depths of her, I think, Nathan's word at the beginning of his commentary here, desperation, is right. So, there are moments when she's in pain and moments of doubt, but her understanding of Jesus and her understanding of the Christian faith, unique as perhaps those understandings were, I think remain important to her throughout her life.
I think there's an irony in seeing how conflicted faith often has a greater power to lead spiritual strivers to God than a convicted faith. We have one more question from Mark Hurst, the great Mark Hurst. He asks, could you comment on the seeming longing that Dickinson expresses in Forbidden Fruit, number 1377?
Let me turn to that one. I don't have it right at my fingertips.
Yeah, there is definitely a lot of longing in her poetry. Look at that.
Forbidden fruit of flavor has that lawful orchards mocks. How lascivious lies within the pod, the pea that duty locks. There are poems that, I think, like this one, can be read as quite frankly sexual. And I do think that Dickinson, I know just enough about her biography to know that, she was very, I think, capable of romantic feelings and romantic longings. And, one of the poems I suggested, Come Slowly Eden, is a poem, I think that, that is, deeply sexual in its implications. All of this might have happened at the imaginative level, but she felt very strongly she felt very strong attractions to others, and she wrote about that. And I think a poem like There Came a Day at Summer's Full, especially entirely for me, I thought that such were for the saints where resurrections be. It's almost as though the power of a romantic love is so great that it has projected her into an experience, of heavenly life, of a kind of post-resurrection life. And, I think that her, capacity for romantic feeling was very profound. I think she does write love poems.
Any more questions? I did have one, while we can wait for questions to come in. I had one comment, and that is another emotion that really suffuses her work is anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
Specifically the anxiety of the poet, which is, will my words last? Will my words be heard? And I just couldn't help but, my mind couldn't help but go to what Keats wrote in his poem, when I have fears that I may cease to be before my pen has gleaned my teeming brain. It really evokes, I think, what Emily Dickinson says in the poem. What number is that poem about? The poet lights a lamp.
Oh, the poets light but lamps, yeah, and
Yeah, it's
they
similar to that, I think.
they themselves go out, right? And
Mhm.
if the poet is capable of writing vital poetry, if the wicks that are stimulated, the lamp wicks, burn on, independent of the poet and survive the poet, then the poet leaves something to posterity that can illuminate the lives of future human beings. And I think it's fair to say that she probably hoped that her work would do that. It's also true that she only published about 6 poems in her lifetime, and though a very small circle of people around her read her work, she died not knowing whether the other 1,749 poems would be published. It's a remarkable personal life out of which the poetry comes, and I think that there's long been a very understandable fascination with Dickinson in this regard.
Well, I think she fits as a pandemic poet.
I think she does too. She self-isolated, as we would say today, and wrote poems. There's a great story about how one of the poems that was dated, she wrote on a paper invitation to a candy pulling. Kind of gives us a glimpse of what her life in Amherst, Massachusetts was like. And she'd received the invitation 26 years before she wrote the poem on it. And it had been on her desk that long. So that's starting to look a little familiar in our own time. I'll just close with a little, with a whole letter that she wrote a couple of days before she died to her Norcross cousins. And the whole letter is, "Little cousins, called back, Emily." This has been great, Nathan. You're so kind to give me this opportunity. Thanks to everyone who's been
Thank
here.
you, Mark.
I really appreciate the questions and the thoughtful responses here, and I just look forward to the next time.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Next year, this is the 4th annual Mark Matheson.
I'll be happy to do it.
Really appreciate
I'll look
that.
forward to it.